following is a special presentation from KPLE-TV.
Welcome to this KPLE special broadcast. I'm Robin Durham, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. I have with me in the studio David Rubin from Shiloh, Israel. He's the former mayor of Shiloh, Israel, as well as the president and founder of Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, and an author, and he has a new book out called Trump and the Jews, and we're going to talk about all of those things in this interview. Welcome back to KPLE.
Well, thank you. Good to be with you, Robin.
It's good to have you again. It's been a couple of years at least since you've been here. I can't quite remember, but we spoke about the mission of the Children's Fund, and I want you to explain to our viewers a little bit about the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund.
Okay. Well, to understand what the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund does, and I may occasionally call it Shiloh because that's the Hebrew pronunciation.
That's the better pronunciation.
Right,
yeah.
but so I may slip sometimes.
That's okay.
Anyhow, so it's important to understand the background of how it started. Now, I grew up in the United States, and I've been living in Israel for 26 years. And shortly after my term as mayor of Shiloh, or Shiloh, about a year after, I was coming back from Jerusalem, driving in my car, and the car was ambushed by Islamic terrorists who were on the side of the road with AK-47 assault rifles.
Oh, goodness.
The car went completely dead when the bullets hit, and I felt a bullet crash into my left leg. Blood started coming out all over the place from my leg. And then I remembered that I had my 3-year-old son sitting behind me in the baby seat, and his eyes were wide open, his mouth was wide open. He looked like he was trying to scream or to cry, but no sounds were coming out. I didn't see any blood on him, but admittedly it was a very dark night, and the terrorists are still shooting this whole time. And I figured he was just in shock, so I tried to start the car. I turned the ignition, I shifted gears, I did whatever I could to get the car to start. It wasn't starting. The terrorists are still shooting. Then suddenly the car started as if on its own, and it drove incredibly 110 miles an hour to get away from the terrorists and to get to an ambulance. Well, we arrived at the next community up the road. A gas station attendant ran up to the car. He ripped off my shirt. He wrapped up my leg to stop the blood flow. He said, "Don't worry, I'm also a paramedic. I know what I'm doing."
Gosh.
And he managed to ease up the flow of the blood a little bit and from my leg, and then he handed me his cell phone. He said, "Quick, call your wife." And my hand was shaking too much. I couldn't even dial. He dialed it for me, and he handed me the cell phone, and he said, tell your wife what happened. I told her I've been shot in the leg, and hopefully an ambulance will soon be coming to take me to the hospital, and our son is okay. Well, I really believed that he was okay at that moment until the ambulance did arrive 30 seconds later, and 2 paramedics leap out of the ambulance. One of them grabs my son from the baby seat and starts shouting out, "He's also been shot. He's been shot in the head."
Oh, goodness.
A bullet had gone into his head where the skull meets with the neck, causing a skull fracture and internal bleeding in the cerebellum. Well, they wrapped his head with bandages, put an oxygen mask on his face, attached him to an oxygen tank in the ambulance, and took both of us on stretchers into the ambulance to the hospital in Jerusalem, where they got to work on us. And I was pronounced the 1,000th victim of terrorism to be hospitalized in that hospital just in that previous year and a half. Well, we both went through our hospital experience. We had 2 operations, each of us. We spent about 3 weeks in the hospital. I started to examine what had happened to us. I started counting miracles. The bullet that went into my son's head and through his neck missed his brainstem by 1 millimeter. The terrorists were shooting at the car the whole time that I was there. And I got shot in the leg, yes, my son got shot in the head, but we survived.
And the car started.
We survived, and the car started, which I did not, couldn't have dreamed of. And the car mechanic later told me they couldn't figure out how to get the car to start. So obviously this was a God thing, and the car was started for a particular purpose. I didn't know what the purpose was at that point, frankly, but about 2 weeks later, 3 weeks after we got back from the hospital, I'm sitting in my living room, and my son was on the other side of the living room, and he was playing in this big toy car that we had, and I was just sitting there reading, and he's on the other side of the living room. He's sitting there in this toy car in his pajamas, and he still had a big bandage on the back of his head. And I hear him talking to himself. So my ears perked up. I look in that direction, and he picks up a doll that he had inside the car, in the driver's seat of the car, and he shows me, and he says, "This is the Abba, the father. He has a hole in his leg." Wow. Which indeed I did, even after my plastic surgery. And then he picked up another doll, and he said, "This little baby, he shot in head." At that moment, I just burst into tears. I became so emotional because I realized 3 things. Number one, this was the first moment that he had verbally expressed anything about that terrorist attack that had happened to him almost 6 weeks prior. Secondly, I realized, my wife and I realized that this is how he is coping with his psychological trauma from the terror attack. It wasn't enough for him to go to a therapist and just talk about his trauma. He needed to be using some sort of play therapy to heal his emotional trauma. And that's when I decided that this is the clear message that God was giving me, that I needed to start what would eventually become the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund.
What year was that?
That was, well, it was already 2002. So,
okay. So you've been doing the
Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. Well, it took a couple of years until I figured out how to do it, how one starts. I was a school teacher. I didn't know anything about starting a nonprofit organization, but I eventually figured it out. The Shiloh Israel Children's Fund was founded as a U.S. charitable organization for U.S. tax deductions for donations in 2004.
Okay.
And since then it's just been so exciting because we have a therapeutic educational campus today, which consists of over 2,000 children.
My goodness.
A boys' school, a girls' school.
Amazing.
An informal therapy activities. We have a petting zoo. We have a music playground and studio. And in addition to that, we have a formal therapy center. So children of all ages are able to receive the therapy that they need. Now, I want to emphasize to you that there is not one child in Shiloh that has not had an experience with terrorism.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Either having a family member killed or being killed or being wounded themselves, or having teachers or friends or neighbors, everyone knows somebody, and everyone is traumatized to various degrees. And the vision that I had was that we had to create this therapeutic educational campus that would be a model, but that in practice would heal the trauma of as I said, over 2,000 children at a time.
Wow, that is just incredible growth, really. And it's too bad that the need is so great, you know, because trauma has not stopped. Terrorist attacks have not stopped in all of these years. What is the climate right now as far as terrorism and the atmosphere that people are raising their children in?
Yeah. Well, when that particular attack happened, we were suffering terrorist attacks every single day. There was terrorism all the time, and I could just take a walk through my neighborhood and come to house after house after house that has had children killed or wounded in terrorist attacks. The trauma was so great. And then we've had periods since then when it's been slower, when the Israeli army has more of a handle on things. But recently there's been another wave of terrorism. There was a terrorist attack just 2 days ago in which 2 people were killed. And there have been other terrorist attacks that we've suffered recently. And an American Israeli was killed in a terrorist attack. So, you know, the terrorism will continue. So you know, I hope that the Israeli government will be able to stop it, but at some point. But at this point, you know, as one who is on the ground, I said, we have to continue our projects. We have to expand our projects so that we could heal that trauma and help restore some of the lost innocence to these children's lives.
Yeah, amen. Because it has been a way of life. And so there has to be the help needed for people to go forward and be able to be healed enough to have a productive, happy life. And so that's what you're providing. I think you told me at some point there was over 20 different types of therapy.
Yeah, there are a lot of types of therapy that we do. Our main focus is on art therapy, music therapy, animal-assisted therapy with the with the small animals. We have bibliotherapy. We have multisensory safe room therapy. We have therapeutic horseback riding as well. We have a horse farm that's about 5 minutes from the center.
Really great.
So we're doing big things, and
Yeah, you are.
and thank God we're healing the children's trauma, and we're rebuilding the biblical heartland of Israel through those children.
Amen. Well, we appreciate you coming and letting us know what's going on and what you are doing with the Children's Fund.
Yeah, and if I could just mention that these projects that we have for the children, that the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund is carrying out, would not be possible if it wasn't for people around the world who stand with us. You know, we have a lot of grassroots support in the American biblical heartland. So from the American biblical heartland, from the Bible Belt to the biblical heartland of Israel, we get a lot of support.
That's wonderful.
And it's a wonderful thing. People can do it online. Some people send in checks. Some people even send cash, even though they shouldn't.
Exactly.
But we appreciate that support that we get.
And then we appreciate what you're doing. I want to talk a little bit about your new book, Trump and the Jews, and I'm excited to hear about it. You shared, when you were here before, a couple other books, and people can take a look at the website and see previous books that David has written. But there's a new one out called Trump and the Jews, and I'm very curious about what's in that book. Okay,
well, as you mentioned, I am also writing books and articles, and this all came out of the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, by the way. If it wasn't for the Shiloh or Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, I would not be writing. But I was with a Christian Zionist friend of mine some years back, and she said to me, David, I think it's time you start writing. Write about the biblical heartland, and write about Israel, and write about what is really happening in the land of Israel, because a lot of people don't get the correct news in America.
That's true.
Unfortunately, you know, at that point they weren't calling it fake news.
Right.
But that was pre-Donald Trump. But the mainstream media was not giving the true story about what was happening in Israel.
Absolutely.
So I agreed. I started writing, and I've been writing ever since. So I've written 6 books, and you know, so people can check them out on the David Rubin Israel .com website. But my latest book is called Trump and the Jews. And the reason I wrote it is because I believe that President Trump has been by far the most pro-Israel president that has been elected in the United States in years. He promised certain things before he was elected, and he's carried them out.
Yes.
And he's truly standing with Israel. And it's kind of interesting because President Trump is, you know, he wouldn't normally be defined as an evangelical Christian or anything like that, but he has a certain gut feeling for Israel. He understands the concept, emotionally, he understands the concept of standing with Israel. And that's tremendous. It bothered me that there are a lot of American Jews who don't get it. There are a lot of American Jews, you know, like the Dianne Feinsteins and Chuck Schumers in Congress, and this Blumenthal guy in the Judiciary Committee, and they just don't get it. They're not biblically connected.
They don't have a biblical worldview at all, that's for certain.
Yeah, so there's something about, you know, they're not being connected to the Jewish roots, and I said, I know that there are a lot of American Jews like that who are virulently anti-Trump. And Israeli Jews love President Trump. We think he's doing a great job. And there are some American Jews who also do. So I wanted to get out that narrative, that it's important for people to understand what President Trump has accomplished and why it's good for Israel, and why it's also good for America to strengthen those bonds between Israel and the United States.
We dig into that just a little bit. What do you feel he has done, and why is it good for the United States?
Sure. Well, first of all, there was the Iran nuclear deal that the Obama administration had signed, which basically enables Iran, it gave Iran the path to a nuclear bomb within 10 years. And in addition to that, it also returned to them billions of dollars that have been frozen for years from American sanctions. And in fact, those billions of dollars were handed over in cash, and they have already been put to work in the past couple of years. In fact, immediately they were put to work in exporting the Islamic Revolution, which is what the regime in Iran supports. Exporting the Iranian Islamic Revolution, not just to all of the terrorist organizations in the Middle East, but also to perform terrorist attacks in the West, in the United States, in France, in England. And they're doing it. They're doing it. And that was all enabled.
There has been a huge increase.
That was enabled by the Iran deal. President Trump came into office. He said, we are going to either change that deal or we're going to withdraw from that deal. And he has followed through on that promise and withdrew from the Iranian deal. He gave several months to carry out a change, but Congress and the European Union weren't moving. So he said, okay, we're out. So that's good for Israel, it's good for America. In addition, President Trump moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv, which is a very nice cosmopolitan city, but that's not the capital of Israel. The capital of Israel is where the two temples once stood, the place where King David and King Solomon reigned, and that is Jerusalem. So President Trump carried out that promise. Other presidential candidates have promised to do the same. He carried it out. He fulfilled it. And in addition to that, he gave the orders recently to close the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization's office in Washington, which has been functioning like an embassy and shouldn't have been. The PLO and the Palestinian Authority are terrorist organizations, and they should not be allowed to function in a free country like the United States. We don't support evil. Americans do not support evil.
Amen.
And by the way, I'm an American Israeli because I did grow up in the United States. So when I say we, I'm identifying as an American citizen, which I still do, even though I've been living in Israel for 26 years and I'm a full-fledged Israeli citizen.
Right. How are his policies affecting everyday life in Israel?
Well, first of all, Israelis are very sensitive to American policy because the United States is our best friend and ally. And very often we ask the question, people ask the question in Israel, is it good for the Jews? And now that doesn't mean that we're totally parochial and we only care about whether it's good for the Jews. We care about the world. Israel, biblically, as it says in the book of Isaiah, Israel is meant to be a light unto the nations. So we're supposed to be closely connected with the world. We're supposed to provide spiritual light and be a positive force for good in the world. And we take that very seriously. So when we look at a president and we say, hey, you know, the people came to me after Obama was elected. They said, is it good for the Jews? The Israelis asked me. I said, well, I don't think so. I don't think it's good for Israel because President Obama, you know, is probably the most anti-Israel president of all the presidents. And then Trump came in, and I think I could say he's the most pro-Israel president. Israelis are very excited about some of the moves that have been carried out. Israelis are excited that President Trump has taken a pragmatic approach to the whole peace process. He says, well, you know, maybe it should be a one-state solution, maybe a two-state solution. You know, and he has taken the fact that the Palestinian Authority subsidizes terrorism and has given $347 million to terrorists and their families over the past, just in the past year, that amount was given. So it's very problematic. And so to talk about peace and to have peace negotiations with people that are giving millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to terrorists that carry out attacks on Israeli civilians, that's a non-starter.
It's disingenuous.
It's disingenuous, and it just can't be allowed to continue. So President Trump has slowed down that whole peace process and is waiting for them to prove themselves that they're really prepared to have peace with Israel. I have my doubts about that. I don't think that's ever going to happen until we make it clear that Israeli sovereignty over the land of Israel, over the complete land of Israel, is a prerequisite to any peace process.
Right. You have to be recognized as a right to exist as a nation yourself. That's never been done.
No, it hasn't been done in the past. And
it's been on the table. It's been part of the agenda, but they have never recognized Israel's right to exist.
Well, generally, it's the land for peace formula.
Right.
That has been the central plank of the peace processes, and it
has never
can't
worked.
It hasn't worked. I even wrote a book called Peace for Peace, which is about that. that you can't have land for peace. Israel is a tiny country about the size of New Jersey.
Exactly.
So if you start dividing up the land, you know, it's not an accident that it says in prophecy.
And you make yourself vulnerable to the West Bank would make you entirely vulnerable to attack. And, you know, the Gaza did as well.
That's right.
And it never satisfied because the overall agenda and end goal is for Israel not to exist, for you to be driven into the sea.
Correct, and they say that. When they speak in Arabic, they say that very clearly. So it's important for us not to be fools, not to be naive anymore.
And it's just wise of President Trump to slow it down and to require, as he is in many other areas of work in the world, he's requiring people to step up and prove that they're sincere about whatever it is the issue is that they're talking about.
Absolutely, and that comes from his background.
Yes.
You know, as a businessman,
yes.
He was a businessman for many years, and he took on some very ambitious projects. But before he did, he always researched the location, he researched the terms, he would examine everything very carefully before going into it. And I believe that for the past 2 years, he has been undergoing a learning process.
Yes, I agree.
Learning about the Middle East, learning about Israel, and learning about the history of the so-called peace process to see what can work, what might not work, what will work. And I believe he's still learning. And even though he talks about coming out with a peace plan, I believe that's not going to be in stone. It's going to be something where he is making certain suggestions.
It's able to be validated. There needs to be validation.
Correct.
Just like all the other treaties that we've entered into, there has to be a way to verify, not just validate, but verify that people are keeping up their end of the deal. We just have a minute left, and I do want to mention again David's book called Trump and the Jews, and you can look at his website, check out the other books that he's written. Also, as I said at the beginning of the program, he's founder and president of Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, and that is an organization you also want to look into after many years of terrorism. You mentioned at least 2,000 are receiving therapy. So we appreciate what you're doing, and it was a pleasant surprise that you were back in our area, and a blessing for you to come into the studio. Thank you for being here today.
I appreciate that, Robin.
You're welcome. Thank you all so much for watching KPLE-TV in this special broadcast.